Okay, thank you for joining today's webinar with Horizons Consulting and PowerSyncPro. The topic of today's webinar is our part 2 of the Masterclass Tech Talk around the implementation, troubleshooting, and final cleanup on Active Directory migrations. So let's introduce the agenda. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the migration experts. We're going to allow them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background. We're going to review the first part of the Tech Talk series around the common problems and the issues to avoid. We're going to go into executing a successful AD migration plan, why monitoring and reporting are essential, AD migration tool demo from PowerSyncPro, and then finally the project cleanup and remediation. We'll also have Q&A. If you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat window. We'll do our best to answer them as we go, or I'll be collecting questions for the end of the presentation. First and foremost, let's introduce our Active Directory migration experts, Gary Cooper and Tuan Von Beers. Gary, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. As you said, my name is Gary Cooper. I'm an Exchange Certified Master and Architect. I'm with Horizons Consulting, have been with them for just over 29 years now, as of this month. So focused, in fact, one of my first engagements with Horizons was on merger activities. So I've been doing mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, and related tasks for the better part of 3 decades. I've also focused heavily, obviously, on Exchange deployments, Exchange migrations, other messaging solutions, as well as directory services now in the cloud, security focus in the cloud as well. So I have many decades of use in these sorts of tools and process.
Great, thanks, Gary. Tuan, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, thank you, Carl. Yeah, my background is kind of similar to Gary's. I didn't attain Exchange Master, though. That's always very impressive. I've been in the Microsoft stack for coming up to 30 years as well. 1995 was my first MCSE. I've been doing AD migrations, Exchange migrations, tenant to tenant migrations. But then in 2018, decided to write this PowerSyncPro tool, originally in PowerShell. And we used that for a year or so on clients just using PowerShell scripts, but then decided to get it written as a .NET application. So since that time, it's kind of grown into the product that you'll see today. And we're obviously extending it all the time, new features coming out. So yeah, looking forward to this webinar and look forward to your questions.
Great, thanks, Gary. Thanks, Tuan. So let's recap, Gary and Tuan, what we showed in the last webinar and go backwards to go forwards. So Gary, I'll flip it to you.
So, the entire migration process for Active Directory on premises is really a 6-phase approach, starting with a project initiation, wrangling in your executive sponsors and senior management, making sure that the organization is aware of the activities that are going to be coming and what impacts and so forth, from the business to IT lead to IT groups, IT leaders, application support. Then we go into planning. Planning and testing are sort of iterative functions. The plans are never fully static until we're done with testing and piloting and so forth. But there's always going to be a little wiggle room there. But we've talked in the past about how planning and testing is important and what facets of that should be done, leading into the piloting phase. And we're going to touch a little bit more on piloting in this, but heavily focused today is going to be the last 2, when you actually, it's time to do the scary thing, push the big red button and start moving people and machines and applications and et cetera. And then following that up with decommissioning. So just as that level set, what are we talking about? What is an Active Directory migration? We're talking about companies that do mergers or acquisitions or divestitures. Maybe you had a previous one that the directories didn't really get touched or didn't get fully integrated, and now you've got multiple AD forests, multiple Active Directory domains that you want to have some closure to. You want to From a security perspective, you don't want all those things out there. You don't want all those different group policies and different administration domains, different permissions, and so forth. So you want to do all that. And possibly just company rebranding. Maybe you're going through a major change in the organization that the company needs to rebrand their identity completely, and that's a reason to do this. Not as often, but it does happen. In the last session that we talked about, at the end of that, we spent some time talking about some things that we've seen or issues that you should be aware of, things that can bite you. I wanted to focus the beginning of this talk talking about a little bit more of those, but specifically looking at ones that we have been called into organizations who have maybe taken this process a little too lightly, or not used the proper tooling, or not done the proper planning and testing, and have left themselves a bit of a mess. And then we frequently get called in to try and fix everything. So I wanted to kind of go through what things we've seen in that realm that you absolutely need to be aware of before you execute. So the first one would be, if you have an Exchange infrastructure, either on-prem or in cloud, and you have Active Directory on-prem, the most common environment then would be having an Active Directory on-prem where you're replicating those objects to Entra ID, formerly Azure Active Directory, and then you have your mailboxes and Exchange online. I've seen very frequently where organizations feel that they can, because you're in a hybrid state in your directory, they feel that they don't need to worry about that hybrid state for their messaging system. So they simply license the mailboxes in their tenant, which creates the mailbox, and Entra ID looks just fine. The problem is your on-prem AD does not. You don't have the Exchange attributes on-prem. What's the problem with that? It's a very common problem in that there's some properties on the directory object, specifically the Exchange Legacy DN, that is really what your on-premises object knows that mailbox by. That has to be carried over to the target directory objects. And if it's not, the impact to that would be, it's possible for users after their mailbox is migrated to take a message that was arrived prior to the migration, hit reply, and it NDRs. So you force the user into, at that point, if you don't fix this correctly, at that point, you have forced every single message to be readdressed indefinitely, right? Until those initial replies have been satisfied. So that's one major issue. Another one would be not understanding what your source workstation deployment really looks like at the deepest levels, right? What applications are installed? What source do those applications come from? How are they managed? How are they patched? How's the licensing work? If you don't understand that, then what can happen during a migration is you don't realize that you've orphaned the ability to patch that application, or you no longer have that license, or the source that you needed is no longer available to you, say in a divestiture where maybe there was some source information that happened to be on some file share. You didn't realize you needed to grab that, and now you don't have a way to, say, install a new workstation with that software. Likewise, not documenting all your enterprise applications and how they interact with the directory. Do they use the directory to authenticate? Are they Windows-based application servers, or are they Linux-based or Unix-based? And if they're doing Linux, they're probably using LDAP. Are they hard-coded to the path that object's in, or what's known as the distinguished name? Because that's going to be different in the target, and probability of breaking those applications is really high. But if you didn't understand that, you could cause unexpected outages. And then not written now, in like a divestiture state, as I mentioned before, there could be scenarios where you don't really understand or didn't realize that certain users use certain applications, and when you migrate to the target target directory, you didn't leave those, or you left those applications behind, and now those users start to complain, but maybe it's too late to get them. Now you have to scramble to try and figure out another solution. Other things, not documenting what won't migrate. If it's cloud services, Planner, Power BI, maybe extremely large mailboxes. Most migration tools have a maximum limit of how much content can be migrated in a certain mailbox, or what parts of a team site can be migrated, or if it can be, what does it look like when the migration's done? Does it look like the user's expecting it to? On premises, are you able to migrate all the SharePoint? Or are there application file shares that you can't migrate or don't want to migrate? So that all has to be noted, and the users have to understand that. Not testing the impacts of a migration on your applications and desktops is another one we've seen a lot, where the users get kind of upset when the applications no longer function properly. And then not fully piloting your process. Thing you're going to see with the piloting is it's very common for us in IT to use other IT users as our pilot. That's great for the first round of pilots, but it's not good if that's your only pilot. You need to include business applications and business owners to that pilot list. So what does it look like when you're going to implement a successful plan? So we're time to execute, right? We've done our testing, we've done our due diligence. If you haven't already, you have to replicate the accounts that you are part of the migration. Maybe it's the entire directory, maybe it's a portion of it. All the user accounts, all the groups, all the distribution lists, all the machines that you're migrating from the source to the target. Then if there's cloud services in both sides, you have to then make sure that you replicate those directory entries from the target up to their tenant. You have to make sure that there are no duplicates, right? Are there conflicting entries? That should have been done during planning and testing, but at this point, it's critical that we get those cleared up. Maybe there's naming changes that need to happen. One merger that I went through, source environment on the display name was last name, comma, space, first name. The target environment wanted first name, space, last name. That was a massive heated debate at the executive level of how they should see the directory when they look for a person's name. Do they look for, Gary, or do they look for Cooper, right? So that sort of thing has to be hashed out and done during the DirSync process. If you're planning on doing cloud services as part of your migration, this is not the direct focus of this conversation, but it's involved. Are you going to do that at the same time as you migrate users and workstations on-prem? Are you going to do it first? We find that most organizations want email to go first. That's how they want to communicate with other people. I think Teams now is a close second before the workstation migrations. In doing so, you need to help executives understand that when their email changes, it doesn't mean the migration's over, because we see that frequently as well. But again, communicating what will migrate and what won't. Even within email, there might be parts that you either can't migrate or don't want to migrate. Then we'll start going into testing with real test accounts after we've synced. Test devices, those should be not pristine devices. Those should be devices that have a history. Maybe you replace another user's device with a new one. You take their old device and you enlist it as a test device. You want all the baggage that device payload offers, because a clean device will tend to migrate much differently than one that's been in production for a year or two. Then we start into piloting. You're going to end up picking pilot batches. Obviously, you can start with some of your friends in IT and some of the people who are going to be most understanding if something goes wrong. You want to try and formalize your feedback. It's not enough to just say, hey, let me know if there's a problem, especially for IT users, because IT users tend to fix the problem on their own and not communicate what they had to do. Especially if they think, well, I knew it was going to be a little painful, so I'm not going to worry about it, and so forth. You need to know everything that went wrong. If it was a tiny hiccup, if an icon set got moved or whatever, you may not be able to fix it, but you want to know about it. Then you want to start enabling piloting for business users. Probably pick users that are understanding, but you need to get business users in at least your major departments on board to pilot and get formal feedback. I often get questions of how many pilot groups, and honestly, the answer is it just depends. It depends on how successful the pilots are going. Typically, I would say at least 3 or 4 pilot groups. I tend to limit them to 30 to 50 people at the most. And my first pilot is probably 5 to 10 people, but I can ramp it up to 30 to 50 because I want to be able to almost handhold these people through the process. I want to sit with them when they're done. I want to make sure that we have a formal feedback process along with that solution. And then we're going to start figuring out how to batch. And this one's always interesting. Depending on the size of your organization, are you able to do very large batches? If you have a 200,000 seat company, obviously not. So at that point, do you do by location? Do you do by department? I've had organizations kind of argue pros and cons of both. I tend to do by location more because I have to think about, after the migration of that workstation, how do I support those users? Do I have people on the ground? Do I have enough support staff available, or service desk, help desk, phone call capacity? Do I need to augment that with outside contractors for this migration? So how do I do all that? And doing it by department that might be spread upon some multiple locations may prove to be very difficult. Plus, if something drastically goes wrong, by this point it shouldn't, but if it did, do I really want to take out all of my procurement department in one shot, or all of my HR, or all of my marketing? I probably don't. I probably want to take a piece of them in this location and leave the rest of them untouched for now. Another piece of feedback, and we touched on this the last time as well, is when looking at, since you're doing users and workstations in this conversation at this point, but not servers yet, they still have to be able to access those old servers. And there's really two ways to do that. If you think about how permissions are managed on a server, it's with an access control list or an ACL. I can use SID history as a function of the Active Directory migration tool to bring your old security ID or your SID and add it to a SID history record on your new entry. And that works fine at first. I urge you not to rely on that too heavily. The preferred method would be to re-ACL the services that are left behind at this point. And what does that mean? That means that I take, I go to certain file shares or certain applications and I say, okay, here's all the security IDs that have whatever permissions they have in the source directory. My migration tool is going to look up that entry, this security ID in the target, and add it as the exact same permission set. So now I've got the same user in two directories has the exact same permission. Now I know that instead of SID history, my permission, my access will work. After I'm done and I verify that and users have been migrated and everybody's happy, then I can run the second part of that re-ACL process to remove the old SIDs, the old permissions from the access control list on that application, and nobody's been hurt. That's a much cleaner way to do it. It's a much more secure way to do it than using SID history, but both are available to you if you needed them. Again, I mentioned before, if you have a Linux or Unix-based application that's LDAP-based for authority to Active Directory, you need to make sure that those are updated properly. Here's the big, if I could leave you with anything of this entire hour, this would be it. It's a very common fact that when something gets uncomfortable, if the migration has a few hiccups, there's something happened that you hadn't seen at any point during your testing and piloting, and the first response to a lot of executive non-IT people is stop everything, roll it back. That is the worst answer you could do. It's very common to want to do that, but the best answer is troubleshoot the problem, fix it, and move forward, but move faster. Once you've started a migration, the light at the end of the tunnel is to get to the end, not to roll back. Rolling back actually makes it considerably harder and more prone to problems. So that would be my cautionary tale, is we've seen people roll back and it becomes very dangerous. The last part before I turn some things over to Tuan is during the migration, you'll want to do this during testing and piloting, is there should be some really rich monitoring and reporting available in the tool set that you've picked. It's actually critical, right? There's two components of that. One is the very detailed logging that we as the experts can go look at on a daily basis and say, how is it actually going? Am I seeing errors or warnings that maybe the user's not reporting it? Maybe they don't even know it yet, but I need to go troubleshoot and fix this. The other one is you've got your management team waiting to see how this is going. I need to be able to give them, those sponsors, progress reports. Hey, we've migrated, 1,000 workstations. We're 25% through. Things are looking great. We've had a few errors, but we're progressing nicely, et cetera. And they'd be able to keep up with that and sell it for you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tuan, and you can show a little bit of how PowerSyncPro works within this.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, so PowerSyncPro, the main aims of PowerSyncPro were around scalability, being able to do this not just for half a dozen machines, but tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands even, and being able to automate things, so make things as seamless as possible for the user. With any migration, there's always a level of disruption for the user, but we're really trying to minimize that disruption. For a straight AD to AD migration, if you've already done the tenant part or you're leaving a tenant until later, it should be a matter of the migration kicking off, the machine rebooting, the user log back in, and they're up and running again. They kind of move forward. That's the ultimate goal. Now, to help with that, we first have to do a synchronization of the users and groups. So effectively copying them from the source Active Directory to the target Active Directory, and maintaining that relationship between the users so that Fred in the source has become Fred in the target, and you manage the mapping of attributes. As Gary mentioned, display name is one, especially if an organization came from Domino where they had last name, first name. They want to go to first name space last name. PowerSyncPro allows you to do that mapping, so you can take the given name attribute and the SN and combine them together to write that to the display name and the target. As well as the sync, there's then, okay, well, how do I see what problems there are going to be or what problems there are? So I'll show you the reporting part of PowerSyncPro, both on the sync side and also on the workstation migration side. So we'll go to demonstration, and I'll just take the screen share. Now we'll do a quick recap just to bring everyone up to speed. So this is the PowerSyncPro console. There are two main parts to the console. There's a synchronization service and the migration agent. If we're looking at the synchronization service, this schedule is built automatically. So when you create a sync profile where you say, I want to synchronize users from this domain to this other target domain, it will build this structure out. So you don't have to maintain that yourself. All you have to do is in the schedule, decide how often you want to run it or whether you run it at specific times of the day, and it will run it automatically. The first thing you always do when you come into the sync service is to set up the directories, whether that's Active Directory, Azure AD, or Google, and you give it the credentials or the app registration or the JSON file in terms of Google to connect to that directory. The directory can be a source or a target. We don't distinguish at this stage. Where the rubber hits the road is in the synchronization profiles. So when you create a new synchronization profile, you will have the option to use a template. So say the user's template, which will populate things like all the mappings so that you don't have to put them in manually. You can also copy an existing profile. So if you've already done one for, if you've got multiple domains in a forest, you've already done one for one domain, you can copy it to avoid you retyping and rekeying things. I'll quickly take you through the user's profile in this case. So this profile is syncing from the demo source to demo target. It's going to look at users in the source, It's going to only create objects in the target, so it assumes that when we do the matching, there isn't a target object there. If there is, you'll get a warning to tell you. We're going to create users, and we're going to only match to users. You can match to users and contacts, which is, again, more of a domino thing. When we get to scoping, you pick the source containers that you want to pick up the users from, and you choose which target container you want to place any new users into. You've got options where you can replicate the source OU structure into the target, so that for GPO application, it makes it a little bit easier. You have the same containers. And then we have 3 refinements where you can choose an inclusion attribute. So for example, you might pick department and then add department equals finance to only pick the finance people. Or you could do an exclusion attribute where, say, you've set extension attribute 1 to not needed, and you can exclude any objects that have that value in that extension attribute. Or you can get more complicated with a complex expression where you combine multiple attributes together, which I'll show you just a little bit later on. After we've done the scoping, we then have the matching rules. So in this case, we're matching the common name in the source to the common name in the target. You can add more than one here. They'll just be processed one after the other. In this case, since we're wanting create only, we're expecting there to be no match. So if there is a match, like I said before, it'll give you a warning. Mapping is all about the source and target attributes. So for each of the target attributes that you've got, what should the value be? Where should the value come from? Often it is just one for one, especially if you're doing AD to AD. Obviously, things get trickier if it's Google or Azure AD, Entra ID in the mix. And then for each of these, you can have expressions. Expressions can either be simple or complex. And simple just means that there is a subset of functions. So you can do prefixes, suffixes, truncates, uppercase, lowercase, or replacing values. They run slightly quicker, although the effect is pretty marginal. And then there's complex expressions, which I'll show you again in just a moment, which use an if then else type structure, and they use C# type code, so you can really manipulate the objects in almost any way that you can think of. Sync options. So this is where we've got the sync sit history that we're recommending you typically want to try and avoid, because the cleanup afterwards, sometimes it's better to just bite that bullet early on rather than kick the can down the road. Syncing passwords. At this stage, this is a password hash sync. We are just in the later stages of acceptance testing of actually syncing the real password, the plain text passwords. Deleting the target object. So when an object goes out of scope or is deleted in the source, automatically clean that up in the target as well. And then for groups, syncing the group members and retaining group members. Retaining target group members means that if you've got a group in the target that contains a mixture of people who are being migrated and people that are already on the target AD, they just weren't migrated at all, you can still update that group in the target, and we'll leave those members alone if they weren't migrated as part of the PowerSyncPro tool. Then the last one, converting contact, again, more of a domino thing where you can take a contact that you've matched to and change it to a user, or if there's both a user and a contact, merge those two together. Again, it's more of a historical thing, but it does come up at times. Then we've got the last two. There's a few attributes that we sometimes want to flow from the source. Sometimes we want to actually hard set them to always be enabled, always disabled. And that includes the account enabled, whether the user account control is set for that user to be enabled or disabled, as well as whether this user is mail enabled or not, whether they have an email address policy enabled, and whether they're hidden from the GAL. For updates, we can choose to keep them as they are on the target, so you can change them on the target afterwards and PSP won't overwrite them again. It's just a one-time sync. And that's sometimes useful for account enabling in an AD to AD scenario, where sometimes you want to keep them disabled in the target and then add migration time, switch them around. So once you then enable them in the target, PowerSyncPro won't override that and disable the account again, which would obviously never be good. Now, I mentioned complex expressions and scoping. So this is an example of a complex expression. In this case, it's if the common name contains TVB or mail contains marketing, then it's in scope. Otherwise, it's not in scope. And you can add more if then else statements. You can add more conditions. You can make them and or all conditions. And we are making that clearer because sometimes it's hard to see. And you've got a whole range of different options for how you do that. Then similar to that, we also have mappings. So one that was asked today was display name. So taking the given, sorry, just checking. Oh yeah, that's if the display name, the mapped attributes contains a comma, then we actually want to use the given name, a space, and a surname. Otherwise, we just use the value in the display name. So again, you can customize these and extend them. And you can also add functions. So like this consistency GUID, it's got more C# like code, like I mentioned, where we're converting, in this case, JobDeck GUID to an immutable ID. So it's very powerful. You can do lots of things with this, including changing the domain. So if you want to use the same left part, but you now have a new domain, you can split the left part from the existing UPN and add the domain you want to the end of it. So right, so schedule. One thing in the schedule, it runs periodically. Like I say, it'll just run through. If I run it now, it will run through these in parallel as much as it can. So it'll run the two import containers, the two import jobs. Once the import jobs is finished, it will run all of the syncs and then run the exports, the SID history sync and the password sync because they were ticked. Now you can see there's one error here in the export. This error is talking about a user Fred isn't able to create it, says the object already exists, and that'll be the SAM account name. There's already an object with that SAM account name. So if we look in here, this is just make sure I've refreshed. Here's Fred. So there's already an account with the name Fred in there, and we've said that we wanted to create only. So it's not able to create Fred because he already exists. Now, what to do about this? You can obviously you can go in the source and change your SAM account name, but that might be quite hard for Fred to understand. So what you can do instead is you can have a complex or a simple expression. In this case, a simple one where we are going to deduplicate the SAM account name. And in this case, we're going to replace the string. We're going to look for SAM account names that have the value Fred in them, and we're going to change Fred to Fred1. When we go back to the sync profile and find the SAM account name mapping, which is here, we can simply attach that to that sync profile and click save and schedule, and we can run this. And notice that the profile has got a little asterisk next to it, which means that this profile has been updated. And as it says here, awaiting what if acceptance. So anytime you make a change, we're kind of forcing you to just have a look at what your change is going to do before it actually applies it. So in this case, we've got Fred. We can look at Fred, and we can go down to SAM account name to show that his future target value is going to be Fred1 now, and not Fred as it was before. So if we accept this change, we can go and export. And now there's no error. And when we look at the users, Fred1's already there. We've got Fred1's returned here with the right same account name. So that's just an example of how you can use the tool to work out, whether how to deal with errors that have come up. And another area that's useful here is the single user report, single object report. This works for groups and accounts as well. Demo source local. Fred1, wasn't it? And it gives you a view of Fred, their attributes, and also which batches that they're going to be in. And the only reason Fred's now not showing up as a target attribute is because I haven't run the full schedule. So all of this happens, the export happens actually in SQL and in Active Directory, but we need to run an import to verify that the changes happened. So if I just wait for that to appear, go back here, choose Fred again. Now we can see that Fred's been connected to the target object Fred. And again, we can look at the attributes. If there were changes pending, we can look at only the changes that are pending, which will show in bold, or crossed out if they struck through, if they're not, that they're going to be deleted, removed. So from a sync perspective, that then gives us effectively a translation table. So when we go to the migration agent side, we've got a translation table, and we can see for the target, we kind of keep track of, okay, this security ID in the source is going to become that security ID in the target. So Gary mentioned reackling. We use this translation table to then do the reackling. So you don't have to provide the translation. That kind of all happens in the background. If there is existing SID history, we will elevate it up to the actual SID. So we won't apply SID history, a SID history SID in the reackling process. We always take the real SID of that user. Now the migration agent is an MSI that you install on a Windows 10 or Windows 11 machine, and it talks back to the PowerSyncPro service. The object for that MSI is to migrate either the workloads, if you've done a tenant to tenant migration, or the device between Active Directories, as we're talking about here, but it can also take it to Azure AD, between Azure ADs or Entra IDs. So it's got a whole range of options, but it gets its instructions from the runbooks. So this case here is an AD to AD runbook. And in the AD to AD runbook, we actually have a prerequisite, which in this case, all it does is for OneDrive, makes the files cloud only, so that when we clean up OneDrive for Business, it removes all those stubs and the machine's clean. And then it goes through these 5 phases at the bottom. So it goes through a startup phase where we can choose to either be in silent mode or show progress. Normally that would be to show progress. In this version, we've got the start migration package, which sets the lock screen background, and we usually create like a local account. There's a fallback account in case we've removed ourselves from the source Active Directory. We aren't able to add ourselves to the target, and we kind of end in middle end. So we have an account. We normally recommend creating an account that allows you to get back in if you don't know the local admin password. And then you can add an actual command package to run. So this is, you can script it yourself. It's a zip file. It can contain other content, other scripts, other artifacts that you need to do things, whatever you need to do on the machine. We've used it for things like removing the SCCM client or removing endpoint protection, those types of things we do in there. Device state. So this is all about, okay, well, it's connected to Active Directory today. I want to connect it to a new Active Directory tomorrow. What do I need to do? So in this case, we're removing it from all directories, so Active Directory and Azure, in case it's hybrid joined. And we're going to join it to an Active Directory. So you can obviously join it to Azure AD or Entra ID as well. For an Active Directory target, you can use the offline domain join. You can choose to reuse existing computer accounts. So if you know that there's definitely no overlaps, you don't need that. But sometimes we've seen when you do a remigration, there is already an existing account in the target AD, and it causes an issue where Microsoft have tightened up being able to reuse that account. If you're using offline domain join, we would usually do a runbook before this that just does the cache user credentials, which will pop up for the users to say, oh, please enter your credentials in your migrated domain, and it will tell you the domain for them to enter their password in so that it's cached on the machine. So that after migration, when they're not actually on VPN at all, they can still log on to their migrated workstation. Again, at the moment, we use a provisioning package to join to the new directory. This again is changing so that we just provide the username, the password, and the OU for Active Directory, or a bulk enrollment token for Azure AD. And if you're doing hybrid, you can either use the SCP record as it is by default with Azure AD Connect, or you can override that to do control validation, where we set registry keys on the machine to force it to join a different tenant than what the actual domain has got as a configuration. The permission updates, this is the reackling process. So usually for workstations, we would do both at the same time, and we just rip through the various locations, Windows profiles, the file system, registry, etc. Application reconfiguration. So if you're doing strict AD to AD, you're staying on the same tenant, you don't need to do this at all. But if you're doing both at the same time, you can reset all of these applications so that they work out of the box after migration. And then the completion tab, there's just a proxy auto detect was a specific issue that a client was having where they had the auto detect settings on IE that was impacting them. You can again create a command package. So again, more scripting that you can do yourself to customize what happens once the machine's migrated. And you can trigger and uninstall the agent. We would normally do this in a separate runbook, not as part of the migration in case you need to do anything to the machine. But it can be uninstalled cleanly from the tool without using a software distribution tool. So that's the runbook, and then you have to assign the runbook to a batch. So assigning a runbook to a batch, again, you pick your source and targets. You list the runbooks that you want this particular batch to execute, and then you can say from what time do you want this migration to be available versus at start time. Now, available means, okay, the user's going to get a pop-up and they can migrate at their leisure whenever they like, and they'll have an ability to snooze up to the start time. Once the start time passes, then the machine will go into a forced migration, as you're probably more used to, where the user again gets a warning to say migration is about to commence. They have up to an hour to save their work, and then the migration will kick off. And the time zone, you can set this to be local or UTC. So if you set it to UTC, all the migrations around the world will happen at the same time. If you set it to local, it will be based on the local time of the machine. So if you set it 9 a.m., the East Coast in the States is going to be a different time than the UK or than New Zealand. They're all going to be at 9 a.m. local time. Up to now, we have allowed scoping by user, but we've found that that's actually more dangerous than we expected. So we're removing that because obviously you have an IT person who's logged on to dozens, if not hundreds of machines. We would see that machine as them being in scope, and that wouldn't be good. So we use computers to schedule the migration against. You can choose all computers. So if you're doing a full merger, you're doing everyone or all the remaining computers, you can leave that to all computers, and then you can exclude based on this list. Or you can say, I don't want to include any computers by default. I just want to list the ones that I specifically want to migrate. Once you've saved that, then the migration agent on the machine, it clocks in every 24 hours to just see, okay, well, what do I need to do? When the migration is about to start, it will again expect to talk to PowerSyncPro to go, okay, has anything changed? Has the migration been cancelled? Has it been postponed before it then actually kicks off? So it means that the workstation does need to be able to talk to the PowerSyncPro server before it actually starts the migration. And that's regardless of whether it's on the LAN or remote, if you're doing remote machines. It will quite happily migrate machines remotely. It doesn't need to be on the LAN. Obviously, for AD to AD, you'd need to use the offline domain join, but the workstation doesn't need to see a domain controller for that to complete. When this is all running, you'll get this agent progress screen where the donuts show how many machines have completed, how many machines are in errors, which ones, or how many machines don't have an agent and haven't started yet. On each of these, you can right-click to go to agent detail. So this is a dummy machine I injected the data for, machine 90, which has an error state. You would be able to go to the agent log here, but because this is dummy data, there's actually no data behind it. But what I can show you is an existing machine. So if I go back to agent progress, just go to agent log here. This is a machine that I migrated last night. And I intentionally actually caused an error where I took the domain controller that's in the target offline. And what the agent does is it will periodically retry. So we try to make the agent so that it's as foolproof as possible. So if someone decides to power down the machine partway through the migration, pull out the network cable, does anything strange like that, it will recover. So when you turn on the machine again, it will recover and carry on. We have got cases where the machine has got stuck due to some environmental reason, and we can create a new run book with an appropriate script to actually fix that issue and send that out to the machine, so that even if the machine is not accessible to us, we can still fix it in the background. So for this machine, once I fixed this error, it just carried on and it finished migrating. So if I go back to where the error was before, yeah, so there it was erroring, and then it started again, and it's just carried on and finished the migration. One thing we do on the machines as well is we collect user profiles. So when the machine is gets the agent, periodically it will see, okay, which user profiles are on that machine, and it will send them back to the service. So you can use this for scheduling. So if you don't know which users own what machines, once the agent's installed on it, you'll get intelligence about, okay, well, at least I can see these users have logged into this Windows 11 machine. That one was on the 22nd of February. Jack has got a profile, but I can't see that Jack's logged in. So it's probably not Jack's machine, it's probably Joe's machine. The other thing we also have is this failed communications. So this is for agents that you've deployed, but for some reason they can't register. Common ones are it's saying it's already registered. If someone's done a re-image of the machine or removed the PowerSyncPro agent and cleared out the registry keys, then when they reinstall it, it will come up here saying it's already registered, or the machine name can't be found at all. So we see this sometimes where the software distribution tool is wider than just the domain we're migrating and accidentally adds the software to machines that actually shouldn't be migrated at all. They're in a different domain altogether. So at least you'll be able to see them and deal with them. Right, I think. Actually, one thing just to point out there, so we traditionally have shipped the MSIs where you have to have .NET installed as well, so .NET 6 at the moment, and we're just moving to .NET 8. But to make it easier, we've actually created an MSI that has the .NET components inside it, so you just have a single MSI to deploy, which makes life a lot easier. I think that's about all for the demo. So I'll hand back to Gary to show some of the user experience dialogues.
Thanks, Juan. Me load the deck, maybe. Try it again. There we go. Let me get to the correct slide.
Thank you, Gary. Now, there's 4 main dialogues.
Sorry, there you go.
That's right. And in the slide deck, we've actually included a process flow, so you can actually see when things are triggered. But from a user's point of view, they either get the migrations available or they get the migrations about to start. We're making these dialogues customizable, so you can change the text. You'll be able to change the title, and actually we're adding a place where you can put a QR code, and then that QR code can, if they scan it with their phone, it can link straight to the documentation for, okay, what to do if the migration hasn't started, or what to do after the migration's finished. So you've got places where you can hook in the communication that you've prepared, because we know users are not always that good about reading their emails from IT. And then the next 2 dialogues, whilst they're logged on, they'll get a migration in progress, please wait. The machine will reboot. The lock screen will say migration in progress. They'll reboot again and they can log on. Once they've logged on, they'll get the migration completed message. And again, they'll be customizing, so you can do it in different languages. It will pick up the language of the machine, so the UI culture of the machine, to decide what language to show to the user. And again, it will have a QR code so they can go to what their further instructions are to carry on. So I'll hand back to Gary to talk about the next step after that. The project's not finished yet.
So, and frequently organizations that we have done mergers for, and for a multitude of reasons are uncomfortable or need to finish some things. Maybe there's an old legacy application that's just going to be replaced and they haven't got the budget or the time to do it right now. But whatever the situations are, we've literally run into organizations where a decade or more later, it's still there. They've never completed it. And obviously you've got patching topics, you've got security topics that go around leaving these old things behind. So it's highly recommended that we get rid of the old servers, any services they provided, old directory entries. Maybe they're deleted, maybe we delete everything and then decommission the old Active Directory and the old tenant, right? Because at some point you may find that you're still paying for licenses for something you can't use. And this decommissioning process, your executive sponsor should be aware of this on day one. When you initiate this project, this conversation should occur. Because if one of your applications, the application owners are being hesitant, we need to be able to have that executive sponsor kind of maybe step in and encourage them to pay more attention to it. And after we've finally cleaned all that up, then we need to close the project. And this sometimes is often, I've seen this overlooked as well, right? So we need to have lessons learned with the teams, with your sponsor. How did things really go? How do users feel this went? Our hope is that users say, I barely noticed it. Everything just kept working. Like that's perfect. Migration tools need to be decommissioned. There might have been permissions or accounts, service accounts that were created during this process that need to be decommissioned and deleted and removed, and the permissions removed. If you have a whole bunch of project plans and status reports, those should be saved for historical purposes in most cases. But if you had an interactive scenario during the migration for the migration team to work in, whether it's a file share, a Teams channel, a SharePoint site, whatever, those need to probably be decommissioned so that they're just not left hanging out there. There's probably recurring meetings that need to be canceled and gotten off of people's books. And then shut down any automated reporting tasks that you might have going on. So that was really the end of it. I think right now, Carl, we can open it up for questions and answers. We can open up people's mics if they have things they want to ask.
Yeah, sure. I did collect a couple of questions. If anyone wants to put anything in the chat window, please do. But one of the questions I had was around the Active Directory. What do I do if my Active Directory users don't have Exchange attributes?
Absolutely. So that one's actually not as scary as it sounds once you've seen it. So if the Exchange mailbox, let's say this was in the source directory, if it's been created just simply by licensing that user's entity in Entra ID and Office 365, that created the mailbox, the on-prem AD doesn't know about this. On-premise with an Exchange hybrid server, basically a server that's purpose is to talk to the directory and do things, you can open PowerShell and run a simple command, enable-remote mailbox. And what that will do, there's a couple of parameters you have to give it, the identity of the person you're wanting to do this for, and then their target and remote addresses. So, but once you've run that, it'll tell the on-premise Exchange that there should be now a mailbox in the tenant. When the Azure AD Connect runs, it will actually link that up. It'll see there's already a mailbox with that exact property set, and it will link them up permanently. So that gives then all the properties get flushed back down that you care about, like the legacy Exchange DN and so forth. So that's the easy way to do that.
Great. I didn't see any else come in, so let's just take one more question that I collected. What do I do if my workstations are managed by Microsoft Enterprise Configuration Manager or Intune?
So first of all, you have to notice it, but I know, Tuan, your tool has a solution for managing that.
Yeah, we've come across this before, and we use those two scripting places, the start and completion scripts, to at the start actually remove the SCCM client from that machine, and at the end we've triggered the Intune enrollment so that the machine is actually properly enrolled into Intune and managed going forward from there. Like Gary says, the trick sometimes is actually detecting that. So pilot testing is definitely crucial in any of this.
And there might, as an add to that, the other facet you need to look at is that in some environments, I don't see this as often or as common, but in some environments, they've used group policies to do some like software installation or some base configuration. Group policies need to be obviously documented in the source environment so that you can determine what needs to be replicated into the target, or are you going to adhere to the target environment's policy set, which then needs to be communicated to users. So there's a whole series of those types of topics as well.
Great. I think those are the questions that, I collected, Gary and Tuan.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Tuan. Thanks, everybody, for attending the Horizons and PowerSyncPro webinar on Active Directory migrations. We'll be sending out the recording not only for this recorded webinar, but also the first webinar that we did on the same topic together on Monday. So thanks again for attending and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.